At just 23 years old, Clara Whitmore lost everything she had ever called home. The wealthy family that had raised her slammed the door in her face after she refused to sacrifice her future for an arranged marriage. With only $90 in her pocket and an old pickup truck left behind by her late grandfather, she drove aimlessly until a forgotten county auction changed the course of her life. When she spent her last $90 on a collapsing survey cabin that everyone else dismissed as worthless, the crowd burst into laughter. Some called her foolish. Others shook their heads and said she would be back begging before the week was over. But only a few days later, while repairing loose floorboards beside the old stone fireplace, Clara uncovered a hidden compartment containing a weathered pioneer journal that had remained untouched for more than a century. Inside were handwritten entries describing an entire settlement that had somehow vanished from every official map in the county. And the next page revealed a truth that someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to hide. But before we discover what Clara found, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is where you are right now. Leave a comment below so we can see how many corners of the world are joining this journey together. If you're listening in the morning, I hope you have a wonderful day ahead. If it's evening, I hope this story helps you relax after a long day. And if you enjoy heartfelt mysteries inspired by forgotten history, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next story. Now, let's go back to the day Clara's life changed forever. The front door closed with a quiet click that somehow hurt more than if it had been slammed. Clara Whitmore stood on the wide stone porch of the only home she had ever known, a single duffel bag resting beside her boots. Behind the polished windows, expensive chandeliers glowed warmly against the gathering evening. But no one came after her. No one opened the door again. Her mother had delivered the family's decision without raising her voice. Clara had embarrassed them by refusing the engagement they had carefully arranged with the son of a long-time business partner. They insisted it was an opportunity, a duty, and a privilege. Clara had called it a life she never chose. Her father had listened in silence before saying only one sentence: "If you walk away from this family today, you walk away from everything." She had believed he meant the inheritance. She understood only after stepping outside that he meant much more. The bank accounts bearing her name had already been frozen. Her apartment in the city belonged to the family company. Even her car had been leased through one of her father's businesses. By sunset, almost everything she had depended on no longer belonged to her. The only possession no one had claimed was the faded green pickup truck parked beneath an old oak tree beside the driveway. It had belonged to her grandfather before he passed away 3 years earlier. He had left it directly to Clara because, as he once joked, she was the only person in the family who knew how to drive a stick shift without complaining. The truck was nearly 30 years old. Its paint had faded beneath countless summers, and the driver's door squeaked every time it opened. But it still started on the first turn of the key. Clara placed her bag behind the seat and rested both hands on the steering wheel before starting the engine. Tears blurred her vision for only a moment. Then she wiped them away and pulled onto the empty road. She drove without any destination. The farther she traveled from the city, the narrower the highways became. Glass office buildings gave way to open fields, aging barns and stretches of forest glowing beneath the late afternoon sun. Around midnight, she stopped at a roadside gas station. After filling the truck with just enough fuel to continue, she counted the money remaining in her wallet. $90. That was everything. She bought a bottle of water and a simple sandwich, then unfolded the old road map she had found inside the glove compartment. Tucked between its pages was a faded photograph of her grandfather standing beside the same pickup decades earlier. He wore dusty work clothes instead of a suit, smiling beside a weathered wooden cabin somewhere deep in the countryside. Clara smiled despite herself. He had always preferred old places over expensive ones. "Guess I'm following your example," she whispered, before slipping the photograph back into the map. The next morning, she continued driving through a valley she had never visited before. Small wooden signs pointed toward farms, creeks, and forgotten country roads. Near the entrance to a quiet town, a hand-painted notice caught her attention. "County surplus auction today." Curious more than hopeful, she turned into a gravel lot where several dozen people had gathered around farm equipment, storage sheds, and abandoned county property scheduled for sale. Most buyers knew one another. They laughed, drank coffee from paper cups, and examined the equipment with experienced eyes. Clara stood near the back, uncertain whether she belonged there. An elderly auctioneer worked through tractors, fencing materials, and old maintenance trailers before unfolding another sheet of paper. "Final property today," he announced. "Former survey cabin on county land. Structure only. Buyer responsible for relocation permits and repairs. Starting bid, $90. Several people chuckled before anyone even looked toward the photograph attached to the listing board. The cabin appeared tired beyond saving. Its roof sagged. One shutter hung crooked. Tall weeds nearly reached the windows. "Anyone?" the auctioneer asked. Silence answered. One man laughed. "Costs more to haul away than it's worth." Another shook his head. "Should have burned it years ago." Clara stared at the faded photograph. Something about the small building reminded her of the picture tucked inside her grandfather's map. The shape of the porch, the stone chimney, the surrounding pines. She could not explain why it felt familiar. The auctioneer glanced around again. $90. Before she could second-guess herself, Clara raised her hand. "Sold," the auctioneer replied almost immediately. A wave of laughter swept through the crowd. "City girl just bought herself a pile of firewood. Hope she likes sleeping with raccoons. $90 wasted." Clara ignored them as best she could, though every word settled heavily inside her. She signed the paperwork with the last of her money, leaving her wallet completely empty, except for a few coins. As the crowd dispersed, a tall man carrying a worn leather tool belt approached her. "You really planning to keep it?" he asked. Clara nodded cautiously. "I guess I am." He extended his hand. "Owen Carter, carpenter." She shook it. "Clara." Owen glanced toward the road leading into the woods. "I've repaired enough old buildings to know that cabin won't stand much longer without help." Clara smiled faintly. "That's encouraging." He laughed quietly. "Didn't say it couldn't be saved." Later that afternoon, Owen led her along an overgrown trail until the survey cabin came into view. It looked even older than the auction photograph suggested. Moss covered much of the roof. Vines climbed one side of the chimney. The porch leaned slightly but remained standing. Owen unlocked the county chain from the front door and handed Clara the rusted key included with the sale documents. "Congratulations," he said. "It's yours now." Clara stepped inside. Dust floated through narrow beams of sunlight. An iron stove stood near one wall. A rough wooden table remained where someone had left it decades earlier. Despite the decay, the cabin felt strangely peaceful. She spent the remaining daylight sweeping loose dirt into piles and opening stiff windows to let fresh air inside. Owen repaired a broken hinge before heading home, promising to return with spare lumber if she decided to stay. As evening settled over the valley, Clara unrolled a blanket beside the old stone fireplace. The cabin creaked softly as the temperature dropped, but she no longer felt frightened. She had no family waiting for her, no savings, and no clear future. Yet for the first time since leaving home, she had a roof that belonged to no one else. Before falling asleep, she reached for another piece of loose firewood near the hearth as she shifted her weight across the worn floorboards. A deep, hollow sound echoed beneath her feet, and she froze, listening to the silence that followed. Morning sunlight filtered through the dusty cabin windows long before Clara opened her eyes. For a few quiet seconds, she forgot where she was. Then the rough wooden ceiling came into focus, followed by the faint scent of old pine and cold stone from the fireplace. The events of the previous day returned all at once. She had no family home to return to, no apartment waiting in the city, and exactly enough food for another day or two. Yet instead of regret, she felt an unexpected determination. If this little survey cabin was all she owned, she would make it livable. She folded her blanket, washed her face with water from a bottle, and began cleaning in earnest. Years of dust covered nearly every surface. Dead leaves had blown through broken window frames, and spider webs stretched between exposed beams. The work was slow, but each sweep of the broom made the room feel a little less abandoned. By mid-morning, she heard the sound of an engine outside. Owen Carter climbed out of an aging work truck carrying a toolbox, several pieces of reclaimed lumber, and a small thermos. "Figured you might need an extra pair of hands," he said with an easy smile. Clara accepted the thermos gratefully. "I can't pay you." Owen shrugged. "Didn't ask you to." Together they inspected the cabin. Owen replaced a loose porch board before checking the roof from a ladder. Several shingles had slipped, but the structure underneath remained stronger than it looked. "She's old," he said, patting one of the support beams, "but whoever built this place knew what they were doing." Clara smiled. "You make it sound like the cabin's alive." "Old buildings usually are," Owen replied. "They just need someone willing to listen." As they worked inside, Clara mentioned the strange hollow sound she had heard beneath the fireplace the night before. Owen knelt beside the worn floorboards and tapped them carefully with the handle of his hammer. Most answered with a solid thud. One narrow section near the hearth echoed differently. He looked up. "You're right." He examined the boards more closely. The nails along one edge were newer than the others, though still decades old. Somebody lifted these at some point. Clara crouched beside him. "Can we open them?" Owen nodded. Carefully. Using a thin pry bar, he worked slowly to avoid splitting the aged wood. The first board resisted before finally lifting free with a long creak. Dust drifted upward from the narrow opening beneath. Another board came loose beside it. Instead of bare earth, they found a shallow compartment built between the floor supports. Resting inside was a small iron box wrapped tightly in brittle oilcloth. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Clara reached down carefully and lifted it into the light. The box was surprisingly heavy despite its modest size. Rust covered much of the metal, but the hinges remained intact. Owen brushed away loose dirt with his sleeve. "Looks like somebody wanted this to stay dry." Clara's pulse quickened. She had spent less than 24 hours in the cabin, and already it held something deliberately hidden. Owen worked the latch with the tip of a screwdriver. After several careful attempts, it gave way with a soft click. Inside rested a leather-bound journal wrapped in faded cloth. The leather had darkened with age, and its edges showed years of careful handling rather than neglect. On the inside cover, written in neat brown ink, were the words, "Nathaniel Mercer, County Surveyor, Spring 1878." Clara turned the first page gently. The handwriting remained remarkably clear. Each entry described daily travel through forests, rivers, hills, and valleys, recording measurements, weather conditions, and observations about settlers establishing new homes. Small hand-drawn sketches appeared in the margins beside carefully measured distances. It looked less like a diary than a working field journal. Owen leaned over her shoulder. "Think it's worth anything?" Clara slowly shook her hand. "I don't know, but it feels important." Several pages mentioned the survey cabin itself, noting repairs to the chimney and roof after heavy storms. Clara looked around the room differently now. Nathaniel Mercer had once stood exactly where she sat, writing these pages after long days crossing the valley. She carefully turned another page. The journal listed familiar creeks and ridges she had passed while driving into town. Then one place appeared again and again: Ash Hollow Settlement. The name repeated throughout the following entries. Nathaniel measured property lines there, noted wells being dug, children helping build fences, families planting orchards, and neighbors raising barns together. Clara frowned. "I've never heard of Ash Hollow." Owen scratched his head. "Neither have I." By early afternoon, they agreed the journal deserved professional attention. Owen drove Clara into town to visit the small public library, where the local history room occupied a quiet corner filled with shelves of county records and faded photographs. Behind a large wooden desk sat an elderly woman wearing reading glasses suspended from a silver chain. She looked up as they entered. "Can I help you?" Owen smiled. "Morning, Evelyn. Thought you might want to see something." Evelyn Brooks accepted the journal with surprising care. The moment she read the name on the first page, her expression changed. "Nathaniel Mercer," she murmured. "I haven't heard that name in years." She led them to a large reading table beneath brighter lights. Page after page, she examined the journal without rushing. Occasionally, she smiled at Mercer's detailed sketches or nodded at familiar surveying methods. "He was one of the earliest county surveyors," she explained, "highly respected for his accuracy. Most of the valley's original property boundaries were measured by him." Clara relaxed slightly. "So this really is historical?" "Very much so." Evelyn continued reading until she reached one of the repeated references. Her brow furrowed. She turned back several pages, then forward again. "That's strange." Clara leaned closer. "What is?" Evelyn tapped the handwritten words, "Ash Hollow Settlement." "I've spent nearly 40 years cataloging this county's history." She walked to a nearby cabinet, removed several large folded maps, and spread them across the table. One dated from the 1880s, another from the early 20th century. A modern county map followed. Her finger moved carefully across each. Rivers matched. Roads changed gradually. Farms appeared and disappeared over time. But nowhere did the name Ash Hollow Settlement appear. Owen folded his arms. Maybe it was renamed. Evelyn slowly shook her hand. If it had been, there would usually be some record of the earlier name. She searched an index of historic communities. Nothing. Another reference book listed every recognized settlement established during the county's pioneer years. Again, nothing. Clara looked back at Nathaniel Mercer's journal. The entries were too detailed to be imagination. He described homes, families, harvests, and survey markers with the precision of someone recording official work. "If he surveyed it," Clara said quietly, "then it had to exist." Evelyn met her eyes over the open journal. "That's exactly why this troubles me." She rested one hand gently on the weathered leather cover.
According to every official map and county record we have, Ash Hollow Settlement never existed.
The discovery that Ash Hollow Settlement appeared nowhere in the county records stayed with Clara long after she returned to the survey cabin that afternoon. While Owen unloaded the tools he had borrowed from his truck, she sat at the old wooden table with Nathaniel Mercer's journal open before her. Sunlight streamed through the freshly cleaned windows, making the faded ink easier to read. The more carefully she examined the entries, the more convinced she became that Nathaniel had never intended the journal to be anything other than an accurate field record. Every page contained measured distances, compass bearings, weather conditions, and sketches of streams, hills, and property corners. Nothing about the writing suggested exaggeration or storytelling. Owen glanced over her shoulder. "Surveyors don't usually write fairy tales." Clara smiled faintly. "That's what I keep thinking." She compared several entries describing the same locations on different days. Nathaniel returned to Ash Hollow repeatedly over nearly 2 years. He noted new cabins being built, fences repaired after storms, orchards planted, and children carrying water from a spring near the eastern ridge. One margin contained a small sketch of 6 houses surrounding a common well. Another described neighbors gathering to raise a barn before winter snow arrived. These weren't brief mentions. They reflected the ordinary rhythm of a real community. "People live there," Clara said quietly. "He knew their names." Owen nodded toward one page listing property measurements, and he measured every boundary. The journal became increasingly technical as they continued reading. Nathaniel recorded distances in chains and links, carefully noting stone markers, old oak trees, creek crossings, and elevation changes. Owen, who had spent years reading construction plans, recognized the consistency immediately. "Nobody invents measurements like these," he said. "If he wrote them, he walked them." The practical certainty of that observation strengthened Clara's confidence. Whatever Ash Hollow had been, Nathaniel believed it existed enough to record it with professional precision. The following morning, they returned to the library carrying the journal, several photographs Clara had taken of its pages, and a notebook filled with her own observations. Evelyn was already waiting at the history table, surrounded by atlases, land records, and early county maps. She had spent much of the previous evening searching additional archives. "I still haven't found Ash Hollow," she admitted, "but I did find references to Nathaniel Mercer himself." She handed Clara copies of several old county reports praising Mercer's accuracy during early land surveys. His work had been described as reliable enough to settle property disputes across the valley. "If his measurements were trusted everywhere else," Clara said, "why would this one settlement disappear?" Evelyn folded her hands thoughtfully. "That's the question." Together, they began comparing Nathaniel's measurements against surviving maps. Clara read aloud from the journal while Evelyn located matching rivers and ridges. Most natural landmarks remained unchanged despite the passing decades. A creek described in 1879 still curved through the valley today. The western ridge appeared exactly where Nathaniel recorded it. Even an unusual bend in a narrow stream matched perfectly. Everything aligned except the missing settlement. Around midday, the library door opened, and an elderly woman entered carrying several borrowed novels beneath one arm. She greeted Evelyn warmly before noticing the large maps spread across the table. "Working on local history again?" she asked. Evelyn smiled. "Always." She introduced the visitor as Ruth Miller, whose family had lived in the valley for generations. When Ruth heard Clara mention Ash Hollow, she stopped walking. "What did you call it?" Clara repeated the name. Ruth's expression grew distant. "My grandmother used to tell stories about people who lived beyond the ridge. She never called it Ash Hollow exactly. She always said our family came from the Hollow." Evelyn looked up immediately. Did she ever describe where it was? Ruth frowned thoughtfully. Only that it disappeared from conversations after her parents were gone. Whenever she mentioned it, my grandfather would tell her those old stories confused people. Clara gently turned the journal toward her. Nathaniel had listed several family names living in Ash Hollow. Ruth leaned closer until she reached one entry. Her finger rested on a surname written near the bottom of the page. Mercer, Collins, Miller. She looked back at Clara with quiet surprise. That's my family. The room fell silent. Ruth explained that her grandmother often spoke of ancestors who settled together before moving closer to town, but she had never seen official records confirming the stories. Family gatherings occasionally mentioned a spring beyond the ridge where children collected water, and Nathaniel's journal described that same spring in remarkable detail. I always thought they were simply old memories, Ruth said softly. I never imagined someone had written them down. Evelyn copied Ruth's recollections into her notebook, while Clara continued studying the journal. The oral history did not prove Ash Hollow existed, but it matched Nathaniel's entries in ways that felt too specific to dismiss. A remembered spring, shared barn raisings, families helping one another through difficult winters, independent memories and written records pointed toward the same forgotten place. That afternoon, as Clara turned another page, she noticed something unusual near the center of the journal. The stitching along the binding changed slightly. Several pages had been removed with great care, leaving only narrow paper edges behind. Unlike torn pages, these had been cut cleanly, preserving the spine. These weren't damaged, she said. Owen examined the binding. Someone intentionally took them out. Evelyn counted the remaining entries. Judging by the sequence of dates, we're missing nearly 3 weeks. Clara slowly ran her fingertips along the empty section. Those missing pages might have explained why Ash Hollow vanished from history. But there was no sign of them inside the iron box or beneath the cabin floor. Even so, whoever removed them had left the rest of Nathaniel's work untouched. As she gently closed the journal, something slipped free from inside the back cover and drifted onto the table. It was a folded sheet of thick paper, smaller than the journal itself, and carefully tucked between the leather lining and the last page. Clara unfolded it with cautious hands. Inside was a hand-drawn survey sketch unlike the detailed journal maps. It showed only a portion of the valley, a winding creek, several compass markings, and the outline of the survey cabin. Near the cabin, Nathaniel had drawn a small X beside a handwritten note so faded that only a few words remained readable. Owen leaned closer. That's this cabin. Clara nodded. The X had been placed only a short distance from the building itself, marking a location that Nathaniel clearly considered important enough to hide separately from the rest of his journal. She looked at Evelyn. Do you think this is where he wanted someone to search? Evelyn studied the fragile sketch before answering. I think Nathaniel Mercer expected that one day someone would find this journal. Clara folded the map carefully and slipped it back into its protective paper. Whatever the missing pages once contained, the survey sketch offered the first direction Nathaniel had intentionally left behind, and it pointed not into the distant valley, but to a place only steps from the old survey cabin she now called home. Clara waited until the morning light was strong enough to see the faded lines on Nathaniel Mercer's survey sketch clearly. She spread the drawing across the cabin table and placed smooth stones at each corner to keep it flat. Owen stood beside her with a compass, measuring tape, shovel, and 2 iron stakes he had brought from his workshop. The sketch showed the cabin, the creek below the ridge, and a small X positioned northeast of the stone chimney. Nathaniel had added 3 measurements in chains and links, but the surrounding trees had changed so much that the original reference points no longer existed. "We can still work from the chimney," Owen said. "Stonework hasn't moved." Clara held one end of the measuring tape while he converted the old measurements into modern distance. They crossed a patch of weeds, passed a fallen pine, and stopped beside a cluster of stones half buried beneath moss. At first, the spot looked natural. Then Owen noticed that 4 rocks had been placed in a rough square. They cleared away leaves and loose soil with their hands before using the shovel. The ground beneath was packed harder than the surrounding earth. After several inches, the shovel struck metal with a sharp sound. Clara knelt beside the opening as Owen widened it. Together they uncovered a narrow iron survey marker driven deep into the soil. Its upper surface was coated with rust, but when Clara rubbed it with her sleeve, 2 initials appeared beneath the dirt. N.M. Below them was a date matching one of the missing weeks in the journal. Nathaniel Mercer. She whispered. Owen nodded. He wanted this point to survive. A small metal tube had been secured beside the marker with wire darkened by age. The cap resisted until Owen worked it loose with pliers. Inside was a tightly rolled packet wrapped in waxed cloth. Clara carried it into the cabin before opening it. The packet contained several field notes written in Nathaniel's hand. Unlike the careful measurements in the journal, these pages described the people of Ash Hollow in personal detail. He wrote about the Collins family sharing seed grain after a late frost, the Millers sheltering 2 neighboring families when a storm destroyed their roofs, and settlers gathering to dig a common drainage ditch before spring flooding reached the cabins. Clara read slowly, picturing the settlement not as lines on a map, but as a place where ordinary people depended on one another. One entry described a widow named Eliza Hart repairing fence posts while her 3 children carried stones from the creek. Another recorded 12 men and women raising a schoolhouse wall in a single day. They built everything together. Clara said. Owen looked around the little survey cabin. That's usually how places like this survived. Beneath the field notes lay a folded letter sealed only by age. The first lines identified Nathaniel as the writer and addressed an unnamed county recorder. He explained that he had begun keeping duplicate records because changes were being made to his submitted maps after they left his possession. Boundary lines shifted. Homestead names disappeared. Areas he had marked as occupied were later shown as vacant. Nathaniel wrote that the settlers of Ash Hollow had completed the work required for their claims, improved the land, and lived upon it openly. He feared that altered maps would make their homes appear unofficial, allowing wealthier interests to challenge or absorb the property. Clara's stomach tightened as she read. He knew someone was changing the records. Owen leaned across the table. Does he say who? She searched the remaining pages, but Nathaniel named no individual. He wrote only that influence had entered the mapping office and that several revisions contradicted his field measurements. To protect the settlers, he hid duplicate notes where they could not be quietly replaced. The letter ended with a request that the original boundaries be preserved until an honest review could occur. Clara placed the paper beside the journal. The buried marker, field notes, and letter all supported one another. They still lacked the removed pages and the full explanation. But the disappearance of Ash Hollow no longer looked accidental. That afternoon, a dark sedan appeared on the dirt road leading to the cabin. The driver introduced himself as Daniel Harper, a local developer whose company owned several properties near the Eastern Ridge. He was neatly dressed but spoke without condescension. I heard someone bought the old survey cabin, he said. I wanted to see whether the rumor was true. Clara remained on the porch while Owen stood near the doorway. Daniel looked over the sagging roof and weathered siding. The county should have removed this structure years ago. It will cost more to stabilize than it's worth. People keep telling me that, Clara replied. Daniel gave a small, restrained smile. Then perhaps I can offer a practical solution. I'll buy it from you for $5,000. The amount stunned her. Less than a week earlier, she had owned only $90. $5,000 could buy food, fuel, and time to find stable work. For a moment, she imagined accepting, driving away, and ending the uncertainty. Then she looked through the doorway at Nathaniel's journal resting on the table. "Why do you want it?" she asked. "The cabin sits near land my company may develop eventually. Controlling the structure would simplify access and liability." His answer sounded reasonable, but his eyes moved toward the interior as though he already knew the cabin mattered for more than its location. "I'm not selling," Clara said. Daniel studied her for a moment. "You should consider the cost of holding on to a ruin. I have, and the complications that old records can create." Owen's posture stiffened, but Daniel raised one hand calmly. "I'm not threatening you. My grandfather spent years dealing with boundary disputes caused by incomplete pioneer surveys. Sometimes reopening old questions harms families who had no part in the original mistakes." Clara thought of Ruth Miller's face when she found her family name in Nathaniel's journal. And sometimes leaving the questions closed harms the people who were erased. Daniel did not argue. He removed a card from his coat and placed it on the porch rail. "The offer stands." After he drove away, Clara returned inside. She and Owen continued organizing the recovered notes until evening. Near the bottom of the letter, beneath a fold they had not fully opened, Clara noticed an additional line written in smaller script. She held the paper closer to the window and read it twice before speaking. "Owen." He came beside her. The sentence was faint but unmistakable. "The official county maps have been deliberately altered to remove Ash Hollow Settlement and the rightful claims of its families." Clara stared at the words, realizing Nathaniel had not merely suspected an error. He had witnessed a decision to erase an entire community from history. Evelyn began searching the county archives before the library officially opened the next morning. Clara found her in the history room, surrounded by deed indexes, tax rolls, survey books, and brittle newspapers arranged in careful stacks. Owen arrived a few minutes later carrying coffee and a small box of nails for the cabin repairs. But when he saw the documents spread across the table, he set both aside and pulled up a chair. Evelyn pointed to a row of survey volumes covering the years after Nathaniel Mercer completed his work. "The original field notes are missing," she said. "Not misplaced, missing." She had found regular entries for nearby districts, but the pages corresponding to Ash Hollow had either been removed or replaced by later copies. Those copies showed the eastern ridge as mostly vacant land. Clara placed Nathaniel's recovered letter beside them. His measurements described occupied homesteads, fenced plots, wells, and a schoolhouse in the same area. How could anyone replace official survey pages without leaving a record, she asked. Evelyn turned to a separate register used to record map revisions. For most years, every adjustment included a reason, a date, and the name of the surveyor who approved it. During one 10-year period, however, several revisions appeared with no explanation beyond the words, "corrected boundaries." The name of the approving clerk had been entered in the same hand each time. "This is when Ash Hollow disappears," Evelyn said. She spread out a county map from the beginning of the decade and another from the end. On the earlier map, faint parcel lines followed the creek and ridge exactly as Nathaniel had drawn them. The later map replaced those small claims with two large tracts registered to outside investors. Ash Hollow's name never appeared, but the land beneath it had been redrawn. Clara felt the same cold anger she had experienced when reading Nathaniel's letter. They didn't only remove the settlement, they turned the land into something that looked unclaimed. Evelyn nodded. And once the official map said it was vacant, anyone challenging that claim would have needed documents most settlers probably never possessed. They spent the morning tracing ownership transfers. The first large tract passed through several investment companies before being divided among prominent families. Newspaper articles from the same years praised the arrival of wealthy land buyers who promised mills, roads, and economic growth. Ash Hollow was never mentioned. One article described the Eastern Ridge as untouched country awaiting productive hands, even though Nathaniel's field notes recorded families living there for years. Another celebrated the opening of a commercial timber operation on land where the Millers and Collins families had built homes. They wrote the people out before they wrote the land in. Clara said, Ruth Miller joined them near noon. She studied the old newspaper with quiet disbelief, then read Nathaniel's list of Ash Hollow families again. My grandmother said they left after strangers came with papers claiming the farms weren't theirs, she recalled. She said some families fought, but most had no money for lawyers. They scattered to other parts of the county. Evelyn recorded the statement carefully. Ruth's family memories did not replace official evidence, but they matched the pattern shown by the maps. The more pieces they assembled, the clearer the injustice became. Clara turned back to the revision register and noticed that the handwriting authorizing the altered boundaries looked familiar. She retrieved the copied maps, Nathaniel's letter, and several county notices from the same period. The revisions had been signed with different names, but the letters leaned at the same angle. Certain capital strokes ended in identical hooks. Even the spacing between words remained consistent. These weren't completed by different officials, Clara said. Evelyn compared the samples under a magnifying glass. You're right. One person appears to have prepared several documents and entered multiple approvals. Can we prove who Owen asked? Evelyn shook her head. Not yet. The clerk's personnel records from those years are incomplete. Clara stared at the repeated handwriting. It was another sign of deliberate alteration, but it did not explain where Nathaniel's missing pages or original plats had gone. By late afternoon, the library's heating system began rattling, and Evelyn insisted the fragile records be returned to their cabinets. Clara and Owen drove back to the cabin beneath a sky heavy with rain. The roof had begun leaking near the loft, so Owen climbed a ladder inside and pressed a temporary patch beneath the damaged shingles while Clara moved the table away from the dripping water. The work forced them to pause the investigation, but Clara welcomed the physical task. Each repaired board and sealed crack gave her a small sense of control. She had spent her life in rooms maintained by people her family hired. Here, survival depended on what she and Owen could do with their own hands. While inspecting the loft beams, Owen noticed a narrow section of wall where the boards did not align with the rest. One plank had been cut shorter and secured with square nails older than those used elsewhere in the cabin. "Hand me the pry bar," he called. Clara climbed halfway up the ladder and passed it to him. Owen loosened the board carefully. Behind it was a shallow compartment built between two roof supports. At first, it appeared empty except for dust and a nest abandoned long ago. Then Clara's flashlight caught a dull brass edge beneath a strip of rotted cloth. Owen reached inside and pulled out a long leather case, cracked with age but still fastened by two tarnished buckles. He carried it down and placed it on the table. The shape was unmistakable. A map case. Clara said. Neither of them opened it immediately. The cabin had already yielded Nathaniel's journal, duplicate field notes, and a warning about altered county maps. Whatever he had hidden in the loft had been concealed separately, high above the floor and behind a wall no casual visitor would disturb. Rain struck the roof harder as Clara released the first buckle. The leather creaked beneath her fingers. When the second clasp opened, the case shifted, and several tightly rolled documents pressed against its lid from within. Clara lifted the lid of the leather map case slowly, afraid that one careless movement might damage whatever Nathaniel Mercer had hidden inside. The rolled documents were bound with faded cotton ribbons, each bundle marked in the same precise handwriting as the journal. Owen closed the leaking window shutter before returning to the table. While rain drummed steadily against the patched roof, Clara loosened the first ribbon and unrolled the document beneath two smooth stones. It was a full survey plat of the Eastern Valley, drawn in dark ink on heavy linen-backed paper. Every creek bend, ridge line, spring, and property boundary matched the measurements recorded in Nathaniel's journal. Ash Hollow Settlement appeared clearly near the center, divided into small homestead claims bearing the names Collins, Miller, Hart, Weaver, and several others Clara had already read about. "This is the original map," she said. Owen leaned closer, tracing the line of the creek without touching the paper. "And it proves those parcels existed before the county combined them." A second plat showed the same settlement at a later date. New cabins had been added, along with a schoolhouse, a common well, and a wagon road leading toward town. Nathaniel had marked each completed improvement with a small circle and written the dates beside them. A third document contained detailed boundary descriptions corresponding almost word for word with entries from his field journal. Clara compared them carefully. Distances, compass directions, and natural landmarks aligned without contradiction. Nothing resembled the broad, vacant tracts shown on the revised county maps. Near the bottom of every plat were signatures. Some belonged to Nathaniel and other survey assistants. Others belonged to settlers who had witnessed the measurements. Ruth Miller's family name appeared twice. One signature had been made with a shaky X beside the words Eliza Hart, witnessed by Nathaniel Mercer. "These people signed because they were there," Clara said. "They watched him mark the land." Owen nodded. "That makes the maps harder to dismiss as private sketches." They carried the case to the library as soon as the rain eased. Evelyn cleared the history table and placed clean archival paper beneath each document. Her hands trembled slightly when she saw the first plat. "I've searched for original survey sheets from this district for years," she said. "The archive only has the later copies." She compared Nathaniel's plats with the revision maps they had examined the previous day. On one side of the table, Ash Hollow appeared as a living settlement with separate claims. On the other, the same land appeared empty before being transferred to investors. The contrast required no complicated explanation. Evelyn photographed every page, then began checking the witness names against census lists and tax records. Several settlers appeared in early population counts before vanishing from property rolls during the decade of altered maps. The county records did not erase the people all at once, Evelyn explained. First, their land disappeared. Then later, histories treated their departure as proof they had never belonged there. Clara looked at the carefully signed plats. Nathaniel had preserved more than boundaries. He had preserved the settler's presence. That afternoon, Daniel Harper entered the library carrying his coat over one arm. He stopped when he saw the original maps spread across the table. His usual composure slipped for a moment. "Where did you find those?" "Inside the cabin loft," Clara answered. Daniel approached but waited for Evelyn's permission before leaning over the nearest plat. His eyes moved across the property lines and witness signatures. "My grandfather spoke about maps like these," he said quietly. Clara studied him. "You knew they existed?" "He suspected they existed. He never saw them." Daniel pulled out a chair but did not sit. "Near the end of his life, he told me the Eastern Ridge boundaries had never made sense. He believed the official maps had been redrawn from incomplete or altered copies." Owen folded his arms. Why didn't he say anything publicly? Daniel's expression tightened. "Because by then, our family owned land that had passed through those revised boundaries. He feared that questioning the maps would threaten homes and businesses built long after the original injustice." Clara understood the fear, but not the silence. So he let the official story stand. "Yes," Daniel admitted, "and I did the same." Evelyn placed Nathaniel's plat beside the later county map. Recognizing the truth does not automatically remove present families from their homes. Historical restoration and modern ownership are separate questions. Daniel stared at the two maps. That distinction may be clear in this room. It will not feel clear to everyone outside it. "Then help us explain it responsibly," Clara said. He looked at her for a long moment before turning back to the documents. The last bundle in the map case contained correspondence rather than plats. Several letters bore Nathaniel's signature and were addressed to the county recorder, the state land office, and a regional survey supervisor. In each, he described unauthorized changes to his work and requested a formal review. The earliest letters were respectful and technical. Later ones became urgent. Nathaniel warned that families who had fulfilled settlement requirements were being classified as trespassers on their own land. He offered copies of his measurements and witness statements. Most letters had no response attached. One had been returned unopened. Another carried a brief notation stating that the matter fell outside the office's authority. The final reply informed Nathaniel that revised county maps were considered official and that further complaints would not be reviewed without authorization from the same local office he had accused of altering them. "They trapped him inside the system," Clara said. Evelyn nodded sadly. Every authority directed him back to the records he was challenging. A handwritten draft showed that Nathaniel considered publishing the evidence in a newspaper, but feared that powerful land interests would destroy the documents before the settlers could use them. Instead, he divided the evidence between the iron box, the buried marker, and the loft compartment. Owen looked toward Clara. That's why everything was hidden separately. If one part was found, the rest might survive. Daniel picked up the copy of Nathaniel's final rejected appeal. "My grandfather was right to question the maps," he said, "but he was wrong to remain silent. So was I." He removed his business card from the table where Clara had placed it after his visit to the cabin and tore it in half. "The offer to buy the cabin is withdrawn." Clara said nothing, waiting. "I have access to land records, preservation contractors, and legal historians." Daniel continued, "I'll use them to help protect these documents and separate historical recognition from present ownership disputes. No one should lose a home because the truth is restored. But the people of Ash Hollow should no longer be erased." Owen's guarded expression eased slightly. Evelyn extended her hand across the table. Daniel accepted it. As they began arranging the correspondence in chronological order, Clara returned to the empty map case to check its seams. Beneath the inner lining, her fingers found a narrow pocket. She drew out a single sealed envelope, yellowed with age but intact. Nathaniel's handwriting crossed the front in larger letters than usual. "To whoever restores the truth." Clara held Nathaniel Mercer's sealed envelope above the library table, while the others waited in silence. The paper had yellowed with age, but the seal remained unbroken. Evelyn placed a clean sheet beneath it, and Clara carefully loosened the brittle flap with a thin archival knife. Inside were 3 folded pages covered in Nathaniel's precise handwriting. The opening line addressed no person by name. To whoever restores the truth. Know first that the families of Ash Hollow were not squatters, thieves, or wanderers. They were settlers who earned their claims through labor, witness, and lawful surveying. Clara read the words aloud. Ruth Miller pressed one hand against her chest. Nathaniel explained that he had hidden the journal and original plats after realizing every formal appeal would be returned to the same county office responsible for altering his maps. He wrote that the men controlling the revised records possessed money, influence, and the patience to wait until poor families exhausted their savings. They did not need violence. They needed only delay, confusion, and official silence. That's how the settlement disappeared, Clara said quietly. Evelyn nodded. Not in one day. One missing record at a time. Nathaniel described his final visits to Ash Hollow. Some families still believed the county would correct the error. Others had received notices ordering them to leave land they had cleared and improved. He recorded helping Ruth's ancestors carry furniture from their cabin after strangers arrived with papers declaring the property part of a larger investment tract. Ruth's eyes filled as Clara read the names. My grandmother said they loaded everything onto 2 wagons, she whispered. She said one wheel broke near the creek, and the neighbors carried the youngest children the rest of the way. Clara searched the letter and found the same detail. Nathaniel had written that the Miller wagon lost a wheel beside the eastern crossing and that 3 families stopped to help despite preparing to leave their own homes. Ruth closed her eyes. She remembered it correctly. The confirmation changed the room. Until then, the journal and maps had proven that Ash Hollow existed. Ruth's memories now showed how the settlement survived inside families even after it vanished from official history. Nathaniel continued by explaining why he divided the evidence. He feared a single hiding place could be discovered and emptied. The journal preserved daily truth. The buried marker preserved the location. The loft plats preserved legal boundaries. His letters preserved proof that he had tried to report the alterations. If all were reunited, he believed no honest investigator could dismiss Ash Hollow as legend. Owen looked at the documents arranged across the table. He built the evidence so each part supported the others. Exactly, Evelyn said. He was thinking like a surveyor to the end. The second page became more personal. Nathaniel admitted that protecting the settlers cost him his position. County officials stopped assigning him work. Former colleagues avoided him. He sold equipment to pay debts and left the valley after learning that several Ash Hollow families had already been displaced. He did not describe himself as heroic. Instead, he apologized for failing to prevent the loss. Accuracy is a surveyor's first duty, he wrote. Yet an accurate line means little when powerful men can move it on paper after the work is done. Clara paused. She understood something in Nathaniel's regret that she had not expected. Her own family had tried to draw the boundaries of her life without asking where she wished to stand. When she refused, they had erased her place in their home as quickly as officials erased Ash Hollow from a map. But Nathaniel's letter also revealed a difference. A family's rejection could wound her, yet it could not define the truth of who she was unless she allowed silence to become the final record. She continued reading. Nathaniel asked the finder not to use the documents to punish descendants who had inherited land without knowing its history. His purpose was recognition, not revenge. The people of Ash Hollow deserved to have their names restored, their labor acknowledged, and their settlement returned to the valley's public memory. "That matters," Daniel said. He had listened from the far end of the table without interrupting. He understood that truth and retaliation are not the same thing. Clara folded the first 2 pages carefully and opened the last. Nathaniel's final request was simple. "If these records survive, place them where no private interest can hide them again. Let the descendants of Ash Hollow know their families were seen. Let every future mapmaker remember that a line drawn for profit can wound generations." The letter ended with his signature and the date of his departure from the county. Ruth reached for Clara's hand. "He carried our story when no one else would." Clara squeezed her fingers. "Now we carry his." Over the next several days, the investigation changed. They were no longer searching blindly for an explanation. They began preparing the evidence so others could examine it without misunderstanding its purpose. Evelyn created a chronological inventory of every document. Clara transcribed Nathaniel's journal entries, while Owen photographed the cabin compartments and buried survey marker to prove where each item had been found. Daniel gathered modern property maps and consulted preservation specialists, making clear that historical recognition would not be used to remove current families from their homes. Ruth recorded her grandmother's stories, carefully separating what she personally remembered from what the documents confirmed. Practical obstacles slowed them. Several pages were too fragile to flatten. Ink had faded along the folds of Nathaniel's letter. The library lacked proper storage boxes, so Daniel arranged temporary archival cases while Evelyn applied for preservation assistance. Clara spent mornings repairing the cabin with Owen and afternoons at the history table, often continuing until the library closed. One evening, while they replaced a warped window frame, Owen asked whether she regretted spending her last $90. Clara looked around the cabin. The roof still needed work. The floor remained uneven, and she had no certainty about what came next. "I regret that I had only 90, she said. Owen smiled. "Fair enough." Then her expression softened. "But no, I don't regret the cabin." She had lost the family that raised her. Yet around the old table now sat people who listened when she spoke, trusted her judgment, and returned each morning without being asked. Belonging, she was learning, did not always begin with blood. Sometimes it began with shared work and the decision to protect something fragile together. Near closing time the following day, Evelyn hurried from the archive basement carrying a gray records box coated in dust. Her face was pale with excitement. "I found minutes from County Land Committee meetings during the exact years Nathaniel filed his appeals," she said. She placed the box on the table and lifted the lid. Inside were bound volumes no one had cataloged in decades. Evelyn opened the first to a page marked by Nathaniel's name. Beneath it, in official handwriting, was a motion concerning the disputed surveys of Ash Hollow. She looked at Clara. "These records may finally verify everything he tried to report." Evelyn carried the gray records box to the largest table in the library and lowered it as though it contained glass. Clara, Owen, Daniel, and Ruth gathered around while she opened the first volume to the page marked by Nathaniel Mercer's name. The minutes had been written in formal language, but their meaning was unmistakable. A motion had been introduced to postpone recognition of several Eastern Ridge surveys until commercial interests and boundary concerns could be reviewed. Nathaniel objected, stating that the affected parcels were already occupied by families who had completed the required improvements. The committee tabled his objection without investigation. In the next meeting, the same members approved revised maps showing the land as vacant. Clara read the entry twice. They knew the settlers were there. Evelyn nodded. And they knew Nathaniel disputed the revisions. Another volume contained a summary of correspondence received from surveyors. Nathaniel's letters appeared by date, along with brief notes showing that officials had discussed them privately before returning them unanswered. One clerk recorded that acknowledging the original surveys could complicate pending transfers. Daniel's jaw tightened. Pending transfers to investors. That appears to be the concern, Evelyn said. Ruth leaned over the page, her hands resting against the table. They chose the transfers over the families. No one corrected her. The records did not reveal a dramatic conspiracy or secret command. They showed something more ordinary and, to Clara, more painful. Officials repeatedly choosing convenience, influence, and profit, while telling themselves that delay was not the same as wrongdoing. Each postponed review made the next easier to avoid. Each revised map made the settlers' claims harder to defend. By the time Ash Hollow families were forced away, the official record had already been prepared to deny they had ever belonged there. Evelyn continued through the minutes until she found a final motion declaring Nathaniel's original plats superseded. The motion passed without his signature. This verifies his account, she said. The journal, letters, maps, and meeting records now form a complete chain. Clara looked at Nathaniel's sealed letter lying beside the minutes. He had trusted that, someday, truth would be strongest when no single document had to carry it alone. That day had finally arrived. They spent the next week organizing the evidence. Evelyn created a timeline beginning with Nathaniel's first Ash Hollow surveys and ending with the county's altered maps. Clara matched journal entries to each original plat, noting the names of settlers, dates of improvements, and witness signatures. Ruth recorded family memories about the spring, the broken wagon wheel, shared harvests, and the forced departures. Owen drew a simple diagram of the cabin, showing where the journal, field notes, buried marker, and map case had been hidden. Daniel provided modern land records and obtained written opinions from preservation and property specialists, confirming that historical recognition did not require disturbing present ownership. The work demanded patience. Some dates conflicted by a day or two because records had been entered late. Several surnames were spelled differently across documents. Clara and Evelyn checked every uncertain detail, rather than choosing whichever version supported them best. Nathaniel cared about accuracy. Clara said one evening, "We owe him the same." Evelyn smiled. That is exactly how a historian should think. The reconstruction gradually brought Ash Hollow back into view. It had begun with 7 families near the Eastern Spring. Within 6 years, it included 14 homesteads, a schoolhouse, a shared well, orchards, and a wagon road. The families were not temporary squatters. They paid local fees, appeared in census counts, witnessed one another's boundaries, and completed improvements required for their claims. When investors sought the ridge for timber and future development, county maps were revised to combine the smaller parcels into large tracts. Nathaniel protested, but his objections were delayed until the transfers were completed. Notices then informed settlers that they occupied land belonging to others. Some left quietly, some tried to appeal. None had the money or influence to overcome records already altered against them. As Clara arranged the names on a large display board, Ruth stood beside her and touched each one gently. "They were real people," she said. "That is what I want everyone to understand." Clara looked at the long line of surnames. They won't be missing anymore. The cabin repairs continued alongside the research. Owen replaced 2 weakened roof supports, and built a secure cabinet where copies of the documents could be stored temporarily. Clara learned to measure boards, seal window frames, and repair sections of damaged flooring. She still slept on a simple mattress near the fireplace.
But the cabin no longer felt like a place where she had landed after losing everything. It felt shaped by her hands and by the people who kept returning to help. Daniel brought preservation supplies without turning the work into charity. Evelyn arrived with food on long research days. Ruth brought an old quilt stitched by her grandmother, saying it belonged somewhere connected to the hollow. Owen fixed whatever threatened to collapse and never made Clara feel incapable for needing assistance. One night, after the others had gone, Clara sat at the cabin table with Nathaniel's journal beside her grandfather's faded photograph. She thought about the home whose door had closed behind her and the family that had treated obedience as the price of belonging. She still felt the loss. She suspected part of her always would, but it no longer seemed like proof that she had no one. Nathaniel's story had survived because people carried pieces of it for one another. Ruth carried memories. Evelyn carried the county's neglected records. Owen carried the practical burden of saving the cabin. Daniel carried the responsibility of facing an inherited silence. Clara had carried the journal into the light. None of them could have restored Ash Hollow alone. The realization did not erase her family's rejection, but it changed what that rejection meant. She had lost one place in the world. She had not lost the right to build another. The following afternoon, they assembled the completed presentation in the library meeting room. Original documents would remain protected, with enlarged copies displayed for the public. Evelyn prepared to explain the archival evidence. Ruth would speak about family memory. Daniel would address modern property concerns and acknowledge why earlier generations remained silent. Owen would describe the cabin discoveries. Clara would tell Nathaniel's story from the journal and letter. Their purpose was not to accuse descendants or overturn homes. It was to restore the settlement's name and recognize the families whose labor had shaped the valley. Evelyn submitted their formal request to the County Historical Commission, asking for a public hearing. For 2 days, they heard nothing. On the third morning, Clara was repairing the porch rail when Evelyn's car hurried up the dirt road. She stepped out holding an official envelope, breathless from excitement. Everyone gathered inside as Clara opened it. The county had reviewed their preliminary evidence and agreed that the matter required public consideration. A hearing would be held the following week with county officials, historians, landowners, and Ash Hollow descendants invited to attend. Clara looked around the small cabin at the people standing beside her, then down at the letter in her hands. After more than a century of silence, the county had finally agreed to hear the truth about Ash Hollow. The county hearing filled the old assembly room long before the meeting began. Farmers, teachers, local business owners, descendants of pioneer families, and members of the Historical Commission occupied nearly every chair. Some had come because they were curious about the forgotten settlement. Others had heard rumors that century-old maps had been challenged. Clara entered carrying the archival case that held Nathaniel Mercer's journal, the original survey plats, his letters, the buried field notes, and certified copies of the committee minutes. Owen walked beside her carrying the display boards they had prepared. Evelyn followed with the bound timeline of archival evidence. Ruth carried a small framed photograph of her grandmother, while Daniel quietly took a seat near the front, rather than among the local developers who knew him. Clara felt the weight of every eye as she placed the documents on the presentation table. Only a few weeks earlier, she had arrived in the valley with $90. No home, and no clear future. Now she stood before the county preparing to speak for people whose voices had been absent for more than 100 years. The commission chair welcomed everyone and explained that the hearing concerned historical recognition rather than modern property ownership.
That distinction eased some visible tension throughout the room. Clara began with the simplest facts. She described being disowned by her family, buying the abandoned survey cabin for $90, discovering the hidden journal beneath the floorboards, and gradually uncovering the remaining evidence concealed throughout the cabin grounds. She avoided dramatic language. The documents spoke more powerfully than she could. Owen explained where each item had been found. Enlarged photographs showed the hidden compartment beneath the floor, the buried survey marker bearing Nathaniel Mercer's initials, and the concealed loft space where the leather map case had rested for generations. Every discovery had been documented before removal. Evelyn then presented the archival evidence. She displayed Nathaniel's original survey plats beside the revised county maps. The differences required little explanation. The original plats showed Ash Hollow divided into lawful homestead claims with witness signatures and completed improvements. The later county maps replaced those same claims with broad, vacant tracts that were subsequently transferred to outside investors. She carefully walked the commission through Nathaniel's journal, his correspondence, the revision register, and finally, the forgotten county committee minutes found in the uncatalogued records box. Each document reinforced the next. Historical conclusions should never depend upon a single source. Evelyn said calmly, "In this case, we have independent field records, original plats, official meeting minutes, correspondence, oral family history, census references, and surviving survey markers. Together they establish beyond reasonable historical doubt that Ash Hollow settlement existed and that its removal from the official record resulted from deliberate administrative revisions rather than surveying error." Quiet conversation spread through the audience before fading again. Ruth stepped forward next. She did not bring maps or measurements. Instead, she spoke about her grandmother's stories of the Eastern Spring, neighbors raising barns together, and the wagon wheel that broke while families were leaving the hollow. She held up the old family photograph and then pointed to Nathaniel's journal, where the same details had been written decades before her grandmother repeated them. "For most of my life," Ruth said softly, people smiled politely whenever those stories were told. They thought they were family legends. Today I know my grandmother was remembering home. Several audience members wiped away tears. Daniel stood after Ruth finished. He did not attempt to defend earlier generations. "My grandfather suspected the official maps were wrong," he admitted. He feared reopening the past would create conflict for people living on the land generations later. I accepted that silence for too long. He turned toward the commission. Historical truth and present ownership are not the same issue. Recognizing Ash Hollow does not require taking homes from families who inherited property honestly. It requires acknowledging that another community existed before those maps were changed. His words eased concerns that had lingered quietly throughout the room. Clara then unfolded Nathaniel Mercer's final letter. She read the passages describing the settlers who earned their claims through labor, the gradual alteration of the records, and his request that future generations restore the truth without seeking revenge. When she reached his final appeal, her voice grew quieter. "Let the descendants of Ash Hollow know their families were seen." The room remained completely silent after she finished. The commission invited questions. One commissioner asked whether any evidence suggested Nathaniel had fabricated the plats. Evelyn answered by presenting independent witness signatures and corresponding census records. Another asked whether Ash Hollow's boundaries matched surviving natural landmarks. Owen demonstrated the measurements using modern survey overlays prepared from Nathaniel's original figures. A local teacher asked whether the evidence could be preserved for future students. Clara smiled slightly. "That has always been the hope." After nearly 2 hours of testimony, the commission recessed briefly to review the submitted materials. Those waiting spoke quietly among themselves. Ruth held Clara's hand without saying anything. Owen walked to the window overlooking the courthouse lawn. Daniel remained seated, reading Nathaniel's copied letter again. Evelyn organized the documents once more, almost out of habit. When the commissioners returned, the chair spoke slowly. The evidence presented today is extensive, internally consistent, and supported by both archival documentation and physical discoveries. The Commission therefore votes unanimously to recognize Ash Hollow Settlement as a documented historical community of this county. A wave of relieved emotion passed through the room. The chair continued. Nathaniel Mercer shall be formally recognized for preserving original survey records despite unsuccessful efforts to correct the official maps during his lifetime. County historical maps will be amended to include Ash Hollow, and the names of the known pioneer families will be entered into the permanent historical register. Ruth covered her face as tears finally came. Daniel lowered his head quietly. Owen smiled toward Clara without speaking. Evelyn closed her notebook with gentle satisfaction. Clara remained still, absorbing the words she had hoped to hear ever since lifting the iron box from beneath the cabin floor. Nathaniel had not failed after all. He had simply waited for someone to finish the work he could not complete alone. After the meeting ended, people approached one by one to thank Clara, examine the display copies, or share stories passed down through their own families. Several descendants recognized surnames from Nathaniel's journal. Others volunteered photographs, letters, and keepsakes that might help preserve the settlement's history. The forgotten community had begun returning to memory almost immediately. As the hall gradually emptied, the Historical Commission chair approached Clara, carrying a small sealed envelope. "There is one more matter," he said. "While preparing for today's hearing, our archive staff located this in a storage file that had not been opened for many years. It was left with the Historical Society long ago and marked to be delivered if anyone ever proved the existence of Ash Hollow." Clara looked down at the aged envelope. Written across the front in careful handwriting were the words, "For the one who finally brings Ash Hollow home." Clara held the envelope while the last people left the assembly room. The paper was old but less brittle than Nathaniel Mercer's letters, and the handwriting across the front did not match his. Evelyn examined the seal and the faded Historical Society stamp in one corner. It was probably deposited decades after Nathaniel died, she said. "Open it carefully." Clara slid a thin blade beneath the flap. Inside was a single letter and a black-and-white photograph. The photograph showed the survey cabin before its roof sagged and its porch leaned, with a young man standing beside the door. Clara recognized him immediately. It was her grandfather. The same image had led her to the county auction, but this copy was wider, revealing an elderly woman beside him and a wooden sign that read, "Ash Hollow Survey Station." Clara turned to the letter. It had been written by her grandfather nearly 40 years earlier. He explained that as a young man, he had repaired fences for an elderly local woman named Margaret Collins, whose parents had carried stories of Ash Hollow after their family was displaced. Margaret had shown him the abandoned survey cabin and told him that the settlement's proof might still be hidden there. He searched briefly but found nothing. Before her death, she asked him to preserve the photograph and leave it with the Historical Society, in case someone eventually restored Ash Hollow's name. He had done so, adding one final request of his own. "If the person who succeeds is someone from my family, tell them I believe the home should never demand the surrender of one's conscience. I hope they had the courage to choose differently." Clara read the sentence again. Her grandfather had died before her parents began arranging the marriage she refused. Yet the words felt written directly to the frightened young woman who had driven away in his old pickup, with nowhere to go. He had known the cabin was connected to a forgotten settlement, though he had never found Nathaniel's evidence. The photograph in his belongings had not been an accident or a meaningless keepsake. It was the remnant of a promise he could not complete. Ruth looked at the woman in the photograph. "Margaret Collins was my grandmother's cousin," she said. "I remember visiting her once when I was little. She kept old names written inside a Bible." Evelyn studied the image. "Then your grandfather was one of the people who carried the story forward, even without proof." Clara folded the letter with trembling hands. She had believed that being disowned severed her from everything her family had given her. Now she understood that one inheritance had remained, not money, approval, or a place at their table, but her grandfather's refusal to let silence become truth. Outside the courthouse, Owen waited beside the pickup while Daniel helped Evelyn secure the archival case in her car. Clara showed them the photograph and read the final lines aloud. Owen looked toward the truck. "So that old pickup brought you back to the promise he made?" Clara touched the worn edge of the letter. "I think he hoped someone would finish it. I don't think he knew it would be me. Maybe he knew what kind of person might try." Owen said, "In the months that followed, Ash Hollow's restoration moved from decision to reality. The county amended its historical maps and installed a marker near the eastern spring listing the known settler families. Evelyn supervised the preservation of Nathaniel's original journal, plats, appeals, and field notes, with high-quality copies prepared for public display. Ruth worked with other descendants to collect photographs, recipes, letters, and oral histories. Daniel funded archival storage and legal review through a public preservation grant that placed all materials under independent county stewardship rather than private control. He refused to put his family name on the project. "The people who were erased should be the names visitors remember," he said. Owen led the cabin restoration, replacing only what could not be saved. The uneven floor remained. So did the old fireplace, the concealed loft panel, and the section beneath the hearth where Clara had found the iron box. He repaired the porch, stabilized the roof, and built display cases from reclaimed timber. Clara worked beside him, learning to shape boards, reset hinges, and seal glass against moisture. Their arguments were small and practical, whether a wall brace needed replacing, whether the old table could survive another winter, and they usually ended with one of them laughing. The work drew them closer, without either forcing a promise before it was ready. By early autumn, the survey cabin opened as the Ash Hollow Museum. The first room told the story of the settlement, 14 homesteads, a schoolhouse, a common well, orchards, harvests, births, hardships, and neighbors helping one another along the creek. The second room showed how the maps were altered and how Nathaniel divided the evidence so truth might survive. The final display contained Clara's grandfather's photograph and letter beneath a simple heading, "Those who remembered." On opening day, descendants of Ash Hollow families gathered along the repaired porch. Some carried photographs. Others brought children who had never heard the settlement's name until the hearing. Ruth stood beside the county marker and read every family aloud. No speech followed. The silence afterward was not empty. It was recognition. Clara watched visitors move through the cabin, pausing over Nathaniel's handwriting and tracing the restored settlement boundaries on the wall map. No treasure had been found beneath the floorboards. No fortune had waited inside the leather case. Yet the journal had changed everything it touched. It restored a community's name, corrected the county's history, and transformed a collapsing cabin into a place where forgotten lives could be seen. It also changed Clara. She no longer measured her worth by whether her parents welcomed her home. Their silence remained painful, but it no longer controlled the shape of her future. She had earned a modest income managing the museum and helping Evelyn catalog local records. She owned the cabin outright. She had work that mattered, friends who trusted her, and a place built through choice rather than obedience. Near sunset, after the last visitors left, Clara sat on the porch steps with Owen. The valley below glowed gold, and the new historical marker stood beside the road where the auction crowd had once laughed at her $90 purchase. Owen handed her the original photograph of her grandfather, now protected in a clear sleeve. "Evelyn said you should keep this copy," he said. Clara looked at the young man in front of the cabin and the woman who had trusted him with a disappearing story. "For years I thought inheritance meant receiving what a family decided to give you," she said. "Maybe sometimes it means finishing what they were brave enough to begin." Owen rested his arms on his knees. "And sometimes it means building something they never imagined." Clara looked through the open cabin door. Nathaniel's copied map hung inside. Ash Hollow's name clearly printed where blank space had once been. Ruth's quilt covered the chair beside the fireplace. Evelyn's catalog rested on the table. Daniel's preservation cases protected the records. Owen's repairs held the roof steady above them. Nothing in the room had come from one person alone. Clara finally understood that belonging was not a reward granted by those with the power to reject her. It was created through truth, loyalty, labor, and the willingness to remain when leaving would be easier. She placed her grandfather's photograph beside Nathaniel's letter in the museum display, then turned the small sign from closed to welcome. The old survey cabin no longer stood as the last thing she could afford. It stood as proof that neither a family nor a county could erase people forever when someone was willing to remember where they belonged. If this story leaves you with anything, it's probably not the value of an old diary or a $90 log cabin, but the truth that history only truly disappears when no one is willing to remember it anymore. Clara lost her family, but she found a home built on trust, kindness, and people who chose to stand for the truth. Nathaniel Mercer didn't live long enough to see Ash Hollow's name restored to the map, but thanks to his courage and Clara's perseverance, those who were erased from history were finally called upon again. Sometimes, the most precious legacy we receive isn't money or possessions, but the opportunity to complete the right thing that someone else started long ago. And sometimes, just one seemingly crazy decision buying an old house with the last of your money is enough to change not only one person's life, but also to bring back the truth to an entire forgotten generation. Thank you for following along to the end of the story. If you found this story meaningful, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and share, so that more people can have the opportunity to hear such hopeful stories. See you on the next journey.